You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. You know this show when I started it about 11 years ago now. We talked a lot about economics, Austrian economics, about fiat money, the economic system. We've never stopped talking about it, but now we're reaching a whole nother level of economic insanity. So maybe the gold standard is more relevant than ever. And to that end, we've got Nathan Lewis on. Nathan's site, newworldeconomics.com, something you might want to take a look at. It's not about necessarily making money in the market or cryptos or gold. It's more about more lofty, wonky things like the gold standard, like how do we have an economic system that provides the most opportunity with the least amount of government intervention and does the most good for the largest number of people. Well, Nathan, it's a pleasure to have you on, a fellow economic devotee, interested party. Hey, you've been writing for 17 years now. During this time, what have you learned?
Well, things have gotten a lot better. Kind of where I came from was a little circle of supply side guys, you know, like Art Laffer, Alan Reynolds, who were gold standard advocates. And you probably remember their and Jack Kemp, their efforts in the 80s to kind of put things back on track after the 70s. That's kind of where I started, you might say. And one thing I found out is that nothing was ever written down. They had all these pretty good insights, but not much was written down. And also there's a fair amount of disagreement among them too, which is another issue. But, I realized that nothing's ever going to get anywhere unless someone writes something down, because it's never going to expand beyond a little group of 10 people. And so I've spent much of the time since then, first writing down some of the stuff that was more or less known among this little circle. And then I think expanding upon it quite a lot to where it's, I would say, unrecognizable, but has gone far beyond that original level.
Yeah. Okay.
My son's working on the lighting here.
So
that's what I've been doing.
So we got the Laffer curve. I think that was one of his from Art Laffer. And so during this time, we've seen inflation kick up again. We've seen vast expansion of the government into the economy. And you've seen basically things, at least on the surface, improve. More people driving new cars than ever before. Even in the US, you've seen a wealth effect throughout the world where really hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, largely through complements of the economic system that we're all, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, a part of. So looking at it that way, what's wrong with what we're doing now? Why should we go back to a system that really was embraced by imperialistic and expansionary colonialists, colonizers back in the 1800s?
Well, to address some of those woke topics, because it worked. The reason why the British Empire eventually ruled a quarter of the entire world's population is because they were just, kicking ass, right? Making themselves wealthy. And actually, we don't often recognize that they took those British institutions and they brought them to places like India, which had been under this government of nomadic barbarians from Afghanistan for 500 years. And he said, okay, let's get rid of those guys. Let's do things the British way, and immediately installing railroads and installing telegraphs and British banking system. And the British eliminated slavery in India, freed 9 million slaves, which is 3 times more than there were in the United States at the same time. Basically built out all of South America, built out Southern Africa, with these highly successful institutions, which we now have a sort of a shadow of today, I think. My most recent book, The Magic Formula, on the one hand is kind of familiar Jack Kemp, Reaganomics type stuff. But on the other hand, I also think is the fundamental recipe that made the whole world wealthy in both the 19th and 20th centuries. And it was stable money, which was the gold standard, and low taxes. Britain had the lowest taxes in the world, except for the United States, during its most successful era.
Okay, I'll almost buy that. But look, no regime has been more oppressive than the Chinese.
Yes.
No, from forced organ donations, and you don't even get a tax deduction for it, and re-education camps, and the most heinous human rights violations on the planet. It is the antithesis of freedom, but they did make one exception to their policy, and that was you're free to make money whatever way you want, just to pay us our cut. And this has lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty, abject poverty. I was in China 25 years ago, and that place was a pit. I was there 3 or 4 years ago. It had transformed. So what are they doing wrong?
Well, first, let's talk about what they were doing right. What were they doing wrong? Well, communism didn't work out very well. And then Deng Xiaoping, when Mao died, there was a little power struggle, and Deng Xiaoping came in and says, we've had authoritarian governments in China for 7,000 years. They never had democracy, right? There are no republics like in Greece. It always been authoritarian governments, and the authoritarian government today is called the communist government, but it's no different than the governments of the Tang dynasty. It's just a bunch of guys telling other people what to do. And he embraced capitalism, which of course was the normal system of China for most of that time. And what we don't realize often of the Chinese example is, compared to, let's say, Europe today, is that although it has a very pushy government, very authoritarian government, they have social credit and all this stuff, but they have low taxes for much of the period from 1980. So 1978 was when Deng came in. From 1980 to the present, the tax revenue to GDP ratio in China has been between 10 and 20%, and compared to 25 to 50% for the United States and Europe. And what we've seen over and over during the 20th century is that if you can keep the tax, so-called tax burden, the ratio of revenue to GDP below 20%, usually good things happen. That's what all the successful Asian countries did. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia. They all had relatively low taxes by that measure. Mm-hmm. And so that was good. They started that in the 80s, and they're kind of crawling out of communism. They're privatizing state agriculture and that kind of stuff. But they had a fairly unstable currency. The yuan in those days was kind of collapsing against the dollar, and they solved that problem in 1994 when they basically had a hard link of the yuan to the dollar. So it was just a fixed exchange rate. And that was when the explosive Chinese growth miracle really took off. So people don't realize this, but between 1994 and 2016, which is in the book, The Magic Formula, nominal GDP in US dollars, so not nominal, and in dollars of China grew 26 times. The economy got 26 times bigger because they had the magic formula: low taxes, reliable currency. In this case, pegged to the dollar. And then, of course, and that has tapered off considerably since basically the crisis of 2008 and 2009, when China took a much more authoritarian stand. I mean, they were much more involved in the economy in various ways. Sometimes these billionaires disappear overnight. No one knows where they went. And there was also sort of some very suspicious explosion of lending by state banks, and a much more interventionist economic approach, I would say, since 2009. And the growth rates dropped way off. It's still pretty healthy. The taxes are still pretty low. Yuan is still pretty reliable. But I would say the Chinese expansion definitely put the brakes on from around that time.
Yeah, and they seem to have been on the one hand, you could make the argument that we've been at war with the Chinese, economic war, for many, many years, and just haven't come to understand it until recently. Are we in an economic war with China?
I think war is a little bit of a harsh characterization, but one thing that did happen, and I think people like Trump tried to get their arms around, is that we had this gigantic flood of new labor onto the world market economy, largely from China, but also India and many other places. And this was due to the lifting of communism, for example. It was due to the WTO and various free trade agreements. It was due to advances in communications like email or whatever that allowed people to build factories in China instead of having stuff built in the United States and things like that. NAFTA, et cetera, et cetera. So that has been, I think, a struggle for most U.S. workers. And now we are kind of getting this point also where we have to kind of take, if you want to call it national security, into account and say, we just can't have 80% of all integrated circuits made in Taiwan, with China saying, actually fairly justifiably, that they're going to take over Taiwan. And Taiwan has long been part of China until the Japanese took it in the late 19th century. What are we going to do then, right? So I think there is on top of this sort of abundance of cheap labor argument, we should have all of the. We don't need complete economic autarky where we don't have any foreign trade at all, but we should have all of the major components of industrial economy have a substantial amount of it contained within the United States.
Do you think China has a legitimate claim to Taiwan?
Don't just survive, thrive. The Financial Survival Network.
Trilogy Metals is a world-class developer in Alaska's Ambler mining district. The company already possesses 8 billion pounds of copper, 3 billion pounds of zinc, over 1 million gold-equivalent ounces, and now over 77 million pounds of cobalt. Trilogy's Arctic project boasts an after-tax net present value of $1.4 billion with a 33% IRR. Trilogy is led by an experienced management team with proven success in discovering and developing projects in Alaska. The company is well capitalized, has no debt, and possesses strong institutional support. Trilogy trades on the New York and Toronto exchanges under the ticker symbol TMQ. To learn more, go to trilogymetals.com. That's trilogymetals.com.
This is the Financial Survival Network. The information you need to thrive now more than ever.
Yeah, there's actually a pretty large Taiwanese independence movement. Independence is opposite, a reunification movement that actually would like to reunify with China. So we'll see where that we'll see where that goes. But you have to think that for United States to kind of have its buddy-buddy relationship with Taiwan is a little bit like when the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba, right? Like, we don't really want our enemies to be quite so close to our borders, if you want to call them enemies, because U.S. has been acting very aggressively toward China. But anyway, so we don't want to get into Taiwan issues, but I think, historically, it's been Chinese for many centuries.
All right. Well, okay. So the road ahead. All right. As it used to be, as the West becomes less free, China becomes more free.
Right. It did.
That is not the case now.
No.
Arguably, we're less free, and they're even less free. But maybe there's hope. We got this movement that seemed to spontaneously erupted in Canada that is spreading to the entire world, the Canadian trucker movement. Does that make you hopeful?
Yeah, it does, actually. I think that we reach some kind of critical mass where at least, I don't know if it's a majority or a minority or whatever, but some large percentage of population of US or Canada, certainly Canada, which has much more draconian COVID-related measures, they say, you know what? We're just going to have to stand up and do something. Mm-hmm. And I think it's great as the truckers, because it was motivated by recent restrictions on truckers moving across the U.S.-Canadian border unless they had vaccines. And only about 50% of Canadian or U.S. truckers are vaccinated. And the reason why is because they got all these long hours behind the wheel where they're listening to programs like this one. So those truckers are pretty well informed, actually. They listen to podcasts all this time behind the wheel.
Hey, if you are a trucker out there and you are listening to this show now, please blow your horn. Better yet, send an email to me, KL@KerryLutz.com. We support you. Think what the truckers doing pretty amazing, shocking in certain respects. I never expected our listened to come from north of the border, but I was listening to a YouTube as I was driving, and a really great young lady was interviewing people. This woman had opened up her hotel room to the demonstrators so they could take showers and clean their clothing. And this one said, this girl had multicolored hair, not somebody I would usually hang out with. Not that I have any problem with pink hair or blue hair. It's just not my thing. She's saying, this is our last chance. We're not going. We're not leaving. This is our last chance to remain free. And that hit me, really did, because I've kind of felt the same thing. Like, this really is the last chance to stop in the West the ultra fascistic, authoritarian rule from becoming the norm.
Yeah, well, it's Canada and Australia has basically been following the World Economic Forum Great Reset agenda, or United Nations Agenda 2030. And so, yeah, I think there's a reason why they kind of ruled. They were pushing it in the Anglosphere countries, Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States, is because over the last 500 years, the English-speaking people have been the greatest proponents of liberty, have the greatest tradition of small, limited government. And if you can take the English-speaking people down, then the Germans and the French, who have had kind of oppressive government for ages, would be a lot easier to control. And from there, going to, India or Brazil or something would be a piece of cake. China's already on board, obviously. So yeah, we have to fight it in places like Australia and Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Otherwise, we'd have some crazy police state north of the border, and they would be saying, work there, let's try it on the US now, right? That's what we have in 6 months.
Yeah, well, I think it's rather remarkable. And so let's look at Austrian economics. It was a backwater for wackos in terms of mainstream economist view of things for 30, 40 years here, maybe longer, maybe going back to when, obviously longer than that, because when Mises came to the United States, out of Germany, seeing what was happening, with the Nazi takeover, they put him in I think he was in Brooklyn College, and, he was supported by his friends. Nobody bought into his theories whatsoever at that point in time. I mean, we were grappling with the Great Depression, Rooseveltism, and all the wonderful things that came with that. So now, though, it seems like there's a whole new generation of Austrian economists, devotees, who really see the wisdom of free markets and the fact that a price of a good is the ultimate intelligence or information as to the value, supply, and demand of that good, if I had to sum it up myself from what I've learned from it. So really, there's a whole new generation of people becoming aware of this information and the power of the internet to amplify even the most benign message and make it near universal. What are your thoughts? Are we gonna eventually achieve free markets because we have no other choice, or do we just keep fighting them?
Well, one thing I've noticed, people are a little more, in a sense, more sophisticated about sort of capitalist institutions than they were in the past. And I even see kind of these lefty, typically younger people are all for, we need, government build housing to resolve the housing shortage and all this stuff. They have, for the most part, legitimate issues, right? Healthcare is way too expensive. There's an artificial shorting of housing throughout the country, which is driving prices way up, especially in coastal cities. And university education is low value. They have legitimate issues, but it's interesting that even these kind of like pretty lefty types, when you introduce some free market solutions to them, they kind of embrace it pretty quickly, actually. They say, well, if it wasn't for restrictions on development, housing wouldn't cost more than construction costs. Because why would it, right? Because if you could build a house for $200 a square foot and sell it for $500 a square foot, you're going to get every developer in the country building houses like crazy until the profit margin went down, right? Of
course.
And any place in real estate, it's not automobiles, so you have location, but you can take a single plot of land with a single family, detached residence on it, and build a little 3-story apartment building with 16 homes. And it's not a 50-story high rise. It's just a 3-story apartment building. And you just increase the amount of housing on that piece of land by 16 times, right? Which is how cities always developed, right? The only problem is we have zoning issues and permitting issues and all of these things, which are causing an artificial housing scarcity. And it doesn't really take very much explanation to the typical leftist kind of person before they get it, right? So I think it's actually kind of promising. I think that there's like a political opportunity that is not taken advantage of. All you hear from the right is, he's like, you don't want communist government housing projects, which is true, but that's not a solution, right? It's a problem. That's an explanation of the problem.
Right.
So I think that's good. And the other thing that we're getting now, I think this is the era that we are in, like just kind of setting aside Agenda 2030 and that stuff for now. But the era that we're in is kind of the era of Keynesianism, sort of government interventionism, big government, right? There's governments that's 30-40% of the economy that began in the 1930s and characterized the last 80 years. Is kind of obviously, it's just getting old and dying, right? Mm-hmm. All this, Roosevelt era stuff like Social Security and not just Roosevelt, but also the sort of Great Society programs. Remember those of the 1960s? Before the 1960s, the federal government was not in the welfare business. Young people don't even realize this. It was handled at the state level, and it was typically much more modest size.
And volunteers, charitable institutions, right?
Yeah, it was very typical for the typical, independent doctor of the 1960s to have Tuesday. He would just do pro bono work for the lower income people in town. Mm-hmm. Just come on by. If you need assistance, we're not charging today. And that's why, just to take one example, the U.S. healthcare system would consume 5% of GDP in 1960s. Now it's 18 or 20%. In Singapore, which has a free market system, it's still at 5%. Anyway, but we're getting to the kind of like the end game of all this mid 20th century high tax socialist welfare state stuff, and it's either just going to blow up in people's faces, which I think is pretty likely, and then they'll need a new solution. It's like, well, it just doesn't work anymore, or they'll try to reform it somehow. They'll say, let's do something else. I think that's good, actually.
Well, I hope you're right. These bad ideas seem to hold on almost forever and propagate themselves in the minds of non-thinking, non-critical people. And hopefully you're right. Hey, so we find your newsletter, the Polaris letter, newworldeconomics.com. And the link is in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Feel free to send us an email. We'll get Nathan to give you an answer. It's kl@kerrylutz.com. Nathan, been fun discussing this with you. Not a lot of people out there to discuss it with, but seems like more now than recently. We wish you the best, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.